funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
Over the years, many Irish men and women have selflessly volunteered their time, skills and services abroad to help empower people and communities. Such volunteerism overseas embodies the noble ideal that it's good and worthwhile to dedicate oneself to helping others. Whether volunteering to improve education in South Sudan, or work with children with special needs in Belarus, or be an independent election observer in some infant democracy, are 1,001 similar scenarios. What unites such volunteers is their undying passion for life and social justice.
Overseas voluntary work.
People on the ground going directly to the people in need. I think that's a great way of doing it.
What are we here for? Only to try and help everybody.
You wanted to, to feel that you could maybe share something, give something, be of help.
We worked with the poorest people to give them a leg up and to help them to become more economically active.
Doing work that is very much needed.
The satisfaction of helping other people.
It was very satisfying knowing that you were able to make a difference.
Over the next 3 programmes in this Giving Something Back series, we're going to investigate the stories of 9 Irish volunteers overseas. We begin with Pádraig McKeown from County Mayo, who, after over 40 years working as a primary school teacher and principal in Ireland, decided to do volunteer work as an education advisor with VSO or voluntary service overseas, in the impoverished West African country of South Sudan. For 13 months in 2012 and 2013, Pádraig stayed in the Christian Brothers compound in Yambio town in South Sudan. And his work entailed much professional development of school staff, parent-teacher associations and various educational personnel.
I devised a scheme whereby we would utilise and build on what professional development that had already been done and put my own programme together and worked with the local staff and asked them what are their needs and how could they help me to devise this programme. Worked with the local inspectors, local head teachers and PTA chairman and so on. They're all chairmen. So we devised a programme and I got a small grant from VSO and myself and the inspectors were able to go around on our motorbikes. I was driving a Boxer motorbike, 125cc. It was fine. It was as powerful as I wanted it to be because the roads were poor, and I had the experience of driving my own little Honda 50 in Dublin during the 1970s, so it was no trouble to drive around. So we travelled around. It was very interesting going to the local schools in Yambio town and sometimes into the bush and giving them courses, just a kind of a school development plans, and then devising programs for teaching methods, because the teaching methodology at that time was, and maybe in certain areas still is, very much rote memory and very little of child-centred methodology being used. So we're trying to change that and make it more enjoyable for the teachers and for the pupils. But it's quite difficult because the resources were very, very scarce. The pupils might have a slate on which they would use chalk. It would remind you of Ireland in the 1940s and the 1950s. And if they were lucky, they might have an exercise book and it'd have a pencil, but very, very few textbooks. The teachers would have very few textbooks, and they might have to share the textbooks between a number of teachers. Classes were very big. You could have anything from 40 up to 100.
Wow, 100 in a class, and no whiteboards, all slate with chalk slate, or whatever. Yeah. This is, the basics.
Yeah, that's it indeed. Now, the schools would have, most of the classrooms would have a blackboard. So blackboard and chalk, again, going back to the middle of the last century for Ireland. And sometimes we were out in the bush and they wouldn't have a classroom at all. The classroom would be under the trees. But that in itself was very enjoyable, I suppose, maybe the wrong word to use, but it's very different, and it was quite pleasant under the shade of a tree, and the birds singing in the background, and the children sitting on logs or on stones, and the teacher would have a little blackboard and chalk and very few resources, but it is so simple and effective in a small kind of a way. And you try and build on that and make the whole thing more interesting. But it was a long slog, and we knew that we were just only dipping our toe in the water, and that it would take a long time to make real changes.
And what kind of changes were you trying to institute, Pádraig?
Well, first of all, girls' education is very much neglected, as it is in many countries. And we were always talking to the PTAs and to the head teachers to encourage the girls to continue their primary education, the 8 years of the primary education, and to continue it on into secondary school, because there's a huge fall-off among girls. There's a fair bit of a fall-off with the boys, but for the girls, early marriage and the dowry situation is really placing a huge obstacle in front of the educational progress of the girls.
So what did Pádraig say to his South Sudanese trainees about the importance of education for girls?
I told them how important it was, and I related it to our own country, to the empowerment of girls, and that our own country had developed, and that many of our leaders, including our recent president, was female, and the importance of empowering 50% of our population to progress the country. So they took it on board, and they put it into their policies in schools, and that they would encourage, the PTAs would give encouragement to girls, give them all kinds of supports and help that girls would need, probably more than boys. And so that was something at least. And then we tried to introduce a literacy program as well, and sustain it through the school development plan, and ways like that. So you'd introduce policies, school policies, and you'd also introduce curriculum policies to encourage people to speak up in class and not to be listening to the chalk and talk teacher all the time, and ways like that, and just get people involved and get the local community to support the school in any way, by bringing food, by keeping this place secure, and by parents especially making things easy for the boys and girls to come to school and not to be sending them out for water, taking up 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening time. Important enough to devise some kind of a system whereby the boys and girls would be able to go to school. So encourage attendance, encourage the level of performance, and we try to work with donor agencies then to introduce more school resources, textbooks and so on.
What kind of donor agencies, Pádraig?
Well, I must say, Paul, that Irish Aid, even though they weren't working directly with us in Yambio, but Irish Aid, when I was in Yambio, are doing great work, and they do great work they actually build new schools, and they train the trainers for training colleges. So we saw directly the work that they were doing and the benefits of their work. And their work and their efforts were really appreciated, and the Irish have a great reputation. So that made my path a lot easier.
And I also asked Pádraig what did his usual workday entail.
Most mornings would be going into the county education office and meeting up with maybe the inspectors and visiting schools, and then giving training sessions to the staff, or maybe to all the local head teachers, and give them, we'd say, head teacher professional development, and concentrate on that. Other times you go to a school and they'd have brought in their parent-teacher association. It might have maybe 4 or 5 parent-teacher associations from the local schools, bring them all to a central location and clarify their role and in school development, and how could they assist in the learning going on at the school. And that is very rewarding. The people are very little, and they appreciate your efforts and so on. I remember going to a school and they had nothing to give. They hadn't even water, so we'd bring water and maybe biscuits. We hadn't got much funds behind us. We were giving person-to-person help more than anything else. But one particular school, all they could give us was a pineapple.
Wow.
So I brought back a pineapple back to the Christian Brothers. We had a lovely fresh pineapple for dessert dinner that evening.
I'd say it must have been very soul nourishing. You're going out there, you're giving of your best, and it's very obvious from what you were saying, Pádraig, earlier on to me, that the information you were imparting was very well received. They were very able, diligent students, and ultimate job satisfaction. Would I be right?
Exactly, yeah. And we go in there and we give a so-called model lesson or a model class, a class of pupils there, and they were so polite and so smiling and so cooperative and so on, and they were so glad to be involved in the class more than because you give a child a centre to lesson different to the road to learning system that had been going on for so time, and they enjoyed it so much, and they were smiling. And then I'd ask them to sing a song because I'd love to hear the African singing, and they'd stand up and sing and dance in beautiful, beautiful tones, boy sopranos and girls combining together, and they might sing. It might be the national anthem.
Pádraig, where do you feel you got the best results in the work that you were doing?
I think the best results and the most long-lasting effects of our work would be those networks that we set up of the head teachers and the PTAs and the most skillful teachers and so on, setting up models of good practice like that.
And Pádraig McKeown had this to say about the big lessons which he learned from his time in South Sudan.
I gave a certain amount, I suppose, but I learned so much from it. I learned the value of each person and the potential of every person, and just developing the potential, not just have it as a possibility, but to actually really make it real, make their potential effective for the progress of themselves and their country.
And that was the national anthem of the West African country of South Sudan. Now, veering away from volunteering in West Africa and turning our attention to Central Africa. In the 1990s, Rosalind Tamming, a trained nurse and midwife from County Kildare, spent 3 years from 1996 to 1998 doing volunteer work in Africa for the humanitarian and development agency Concern. Some of her work there entailed helping to run an emergency health and feeding centre for Rwandan refugees in the Central African country of Zaire. Many of them who'd fled the Rwandan genocide a few years earlier in 1994 now found themselves stuck in neighbouring Zaire without food or sustenance and on the brink of starvation. Rosalind Tamming.
Politically, all the refugees, the Rwandan refugees, I can't even remember exactly what prompted it, but like over 1 million went back into Rwanda basically over the space of a week. But there was one cohort of refugees who were sort of kept as like human shields or what's the word? Like collateral. Anyway, this rebels sort of brought them westwards
as a buffer, so to speak.
Yeah, a buffer.
You know, if they were going to be attacked, these were going to be taken out first.
Yeah. So they moved westwards into the middle of Zaire, but they had nothing. It was a huge crisis at the time. So all these people were brought by train and then barge across, from deep in the forest out to Kisangani, where we were there to receive them. And I remember they'd come off the barges onto the back of trucks. They'd be driven to where we were, which was an abandoned farmhouse. I mean, there was nothing fancy about it. We had the farmhouse for the unaccompanied children. MSF, another organisation, had the stables for the sort of accompanied children, or the hospital sort of part of it. And they'd come off the trucks at 10 o'clock at night. It was almost pitch black. So you'd just feel a child to see if they were hot. If they were hot, you'd send them one direction to sort of medical, because you assume they had a temperature. You'd put your hand roughly around the top of their arm. If it felt skinny, so this is very rudimentary, you put them in our centre where they're malnourished. And then if they looked okay, they'd go in sort of this big tent where they could sleep or whatever. But the children, so as I said, we had unaccompanied children. So they had no parents with them. And we had babies. And people had taken the babies off the backs of mothers who were shot as they were running through the forest.
As they were fleeing the conflict situation in Zaire at that time, a horrific situation.
Yes, because there was a lot of conflict internally there. So I'm not even sure exactly the workings of it. It was all very complicated. We had about 100 children in a couple of rooms in this abandoned farmhouse, no windows or anything. And the thing was, I hadn't worked with children who were malnourished up to this point. And the girl who was supposed to train me in, who was there, flew out on a plane with malaria as I flew in. So basically I was it. there were a few people supporting, but nobody with medical knowledge. Even to get staff, one of the girls got in a truck, drove around the streets of Kisangani. Any woman she saw that had a child, who therefore was a mother, who therefore sort of knew how to look after children, will you come and work for us? Will you come and work for us? And we got all these women who were, they'd no experience. We just had to get people, bodies, to come and help. And I must say they were fantastic. I remember we worked for 3 weeks straight. Nobody got a day off until I managed to sit down and be able to have a bit of time to do a roster. It was the middle of a rainforest. It was so hot and humid. I remember sitting trying to fill in a chart, and my eyes were stinging with the sweat rolling down into my eyes. But the children, I mean, it wasn't just the malnutrition, but they were very sick, a lot of them. They had anemia, some of them were probably HIV positive, and a lot of them died. And it was difficult because you were doing as much as you could, but it wasn't enough. And you had MSF who had doctors, so I'd be bringing them over or bringing the kids over to the doctor, but there was nothing they could do. We had no facilities. Those children wouldn't die here, but they died by the dozen there. And then there were people who'd come with body bags, and I remember them standing in the middle of the room going, oh, will we put 2 bodies in this bag or just one? They're only children. We could stick 2 in front of all the other children who are watching this. So it was sort of traumatic. And I remember very clearly when I did my training in Beaumont, you were always taught the most important patient on the ward is the dying patient, right? The rest of them could wait for their shower or their medicines or whatever it is. You had to look after the dying patient first, make sure they were comfortable. Well, here it was the opposite. Because you did not have the time to sit with a dying child, because the rest of them would die if they didn't get their medicine, if they didn't get their milk or whatever it was. So I found that very difficult to sort of cope with.
And another major challenge which Rosalind Tamming faced was the language.
When I was in Zaire with the Rwandan refugees, so none of the local staff we had employed could speak Kinyarwanda, which was the Rwandan language. They spoke Linga, I think it was called Linga. And so what we did was we find an older child who spoke Swahili and a Zairean person who spoke Swahili. So the older Rwandan child would ask a younger Rwandan child. So for example, do you have diarrhea? That was a common question, right? And then would speak in Swahili back to the Zairean lady, who would translate it from Swahili into Linga, and then someone who spoke Linga who could also speak French would say it to me, and then my French wasn't great either, but anyway, I could understand enough French to... So we had 4 languages to ask a child a question.
Do you have diarrhea?
Yeah, so eventually I learned about 4 Kinyarwandan phrases that I could ask the child directly. Do you have diarrhea? Or, whatever I was asking, I can't remember now, but yeah.
Wow, so I mean, it's something we take for granted, but aren't you happy you took that French in school?
Yeah, I am, yeah. And it improved in Africa, because I've worked in a good few francophone countries, but it still wouldn't be where it should be. There were a lot of success stories as well. So it's particularly in the feeding centres, when a child comes in and does... a lot of them do well. If they're cared for properly, they get their milk. It's purely, they may have pneumonia as well as being malnourished, something like that. So you're treating them both with antibiotics and the milk. The difference in those children even in a week, you see them perking up, their heads, their eyes have a bit of shine in them. Then within 2 weeks, they might be up running around, getting inquisitive, looking to play games, that sort of thing. Within 3 weeks, they're sort of... everything going according to plan, they're getting ready to maybe go home. So usually it'd be 4 weeks, maybe they'd be in the centre. So by the 4th week, they're bright-eyed, beautiful, beautiful children, and you really can see a difference. Now, cameras back in the time, we didn't, we had a few, but I don't have pictures myself of the before and afters, but I know in my mind's eye, I can see lots of children before and after. I remember 2 little girls, they were about 4, and they were so withdrawn and they were unaccompanied, they had no parents with them. Very sad looking little girls, but beautiful. And I remember the first time they smiled, which was You know, they just had beautiful little smiles. And it was because they were now able to smile, because they were getting better and recovering. And that was, you know, that's a little small win.
So what kept Rosalind Tamming working nearly 24/7 for 7 months during her time in Zaire?
Well, you couldn't stop. You couldn't stop because there were, you know, things to do and other children there. And we definitely did save lives. I can say that for definite. There were ones we didn't manage to save. Maybe, you know, you do question yourself, if I had been more experienced, you know, would I have done things differently? How could we have improved? You know, you always ask those questions, and you should, of course. But yeah, we were making a difference. And you didn't really have time to think. You were so busy and working so hard that, you know, it's only afterwards when you think back, you go, oh, that was a tough time. Yeah.
And staying with volunteering in Africa, in the year 1994, retired bank manager Gearóid Kilgannon spent 3 months working as a volunteer independent election observer in association with the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in the first ever democratic elections in South Africa. So what exactly did his work entail? Gearóid Kilgannon.
We were election observing, and the election observing began, as it always does in those missions, some couple of months before the election. It entails ensuring that election rallies, election meetings, that these all take place in a peaceful surround, to make sure that the local military don't intimidate the electioneering people, to make sure that a rival group, if they arrive on the scene, you want to keep an eye on them and make sure. And then you would, of course, have to go to get the police to intervene between them, because it might turn nasty. It was a case of observing and making sure that democracy was being served at all times prior to the election, the run-up to the election, and that nobody could or should or did get hurt in the process.
And Gearóid was just one of several volunteer independent election observers from Ireland, helping to oversee South Africa's transition to democracy in 1994.
Everybody who was there was working on a voluntary basis. We did get a stipend, which was to pay for our food every day, but I suppose most of the people who were there were people who were committed to the cause. And it was we were very happy to pay our own way. I mean, I rented an apartment. I could well afford it because I had retired from work and I had my pension.
So what was the political situation like in South Africa during Gearóid Kilgannon's time there?
Things were fraught at the time in South Africa. There was various trepidation. People had trepidation that there was going to be violence, of course, because there were various organisations. There was the ANC, which was the main political body, the African National Congress, of whom Nelson Mandela, of course, was the chair of the African National Congress. And there was the Pan-Africanist Congress. There were various other political parties. Some of them were committed to violence and some of them weren't. As an election observer, before the elections, we had to go to big political rallies. I remember one in particular in the township of Athlone outside of Cape Town, and that was what we called a coloured township, and that was addressed by Nelson Mandela. That day there was this enormous crowd turned out, and that was really the most extraordinarily exciting to see Mandela up there, and he really was working the crowd and he was really coming through in all his glory. And he was a man who was committed to peaceful means.
And as election day approached in South Africa in April 1994, what exactly was the mood like?
Well, the mood was, to put it mildly, invigorating, exhilarating from my point of view, being an opponent of the apartheid system. I mean, I'll never forget those extraordinary rallies where enormous crowds of black people, not all necessarily black people, there might have been some brave white people and certainly some coloured and some Indian people may have been amongst the crowds, but to see those enormous gatherings of people toy-toying down streets. Remember the toy where they danced this little short step and they'd all toy down streets. That was really fantastic. There seemed to be nothing to stop those crowds of people toy-toying. And of course, as it turned out, nothing could stop them. And the 24th, 25th and 26th of April 1994 were absolutely magic days. There were 3 days of the elections. And I will never forget waking up on the first morning. I left home at 5 o'clock. I had an apartment high up over the sea in Camps Bay outside Cape Town. And the sun was shining brightly that day, and I hadn't slept very much. And as I drove out to the Mitchell's Plains, where the black townships were situated, I was going to do election observation, principally in Guguletu, but also in Khayelitsha and Langa and Nyanga. And that morning, driving out there at 5 and 6 o'clock, the sun was up, and already there were lines, massive lines of black people all over the country, all over the city as I passed along and out in the township, all dressed in their finest clothes, all beaming, all delighted. My heart just sort of rose at me. I was quite excited and elated at the whole idea that this was happening. The years of striving, and this was wonderful to be there, to witness this dawn of hope. Or it was more than a dawn of hope. It was the day of hope. Anyway, we won't go into history thereafter, but it was a wonderful day to be in South Africa and to witness the risen people, you might say, to borrow a phrase from Irish history. It was the day of the risen people, and it was very exciting.
So what big lessons did Gearóid Kilgannon learn from his volunteering work in South Africa in the 1990s?
Well, I suppose the principal lesson I took away with me was that right will prevail eventually. It might have been a case of might over right in the years prior to the election, but right triumphed in the elections, and democracy works.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.